Hi, and welcome to Royal Holloway. Thank you for joining us this evening, in particular to those guests who I know have come from other parts to be here. Inaugural lectures are an important personal and professional milestone, and they're an opportunity for us to recognise and showcase the academic achievements of our staff here at Royal Holloway. Tonight we celebrate the achievements of Professor Nathan Widder. Nathan is Professor of Political Theory at Royal Holloway and a former head in the Department of Politics and International Relations, and it was my great honour to work with Nathan when he was head of department and I was his dean. Nathan moved to the UK in 1992 after completing an undergraduate degree at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He continued his education with an MSc at the London School of Economics and gained a PhD at the University of Essex under the supervision of Professor Ernesto Lacau and Professor Johnny Golding. We are hoping that Johnny Golding, who's now Professor of Philosophy and Fine Art at the Royal College of Art, will join us tonight and give a vote of thanks at the end of Nathan's lecture, but I think she's still on the train from what we gather. After gaining his PhD, Nathan went on to hold a 2-year teaching fellowship at LSE and in 2001 moved to Exeter, where he took up his first permanent lectureship. In 2006, Nathan joined Royal Holloway, taking up a senior lectureship here and then serving as head of department, as I've already mentioned. Nathan's teaching and research covers the history of Western political thought and philosophy, contemporary continental philosophy, and feminist political theory. His work focuses on questions of difference, pluralism, power, identity, and knowledge, and he has drawn on ideas in contemporary thought in order to stage a reenactment with both central and marginal figures in ancient, early Christian and medieval philosophy. Nathan has published articles in a number of prominent journals, and his main publications are 3 monographs: Genealogies of Difference, Reflections on Time and Politics, and Political Theory after Deleuze. Following tonight's lecture, we hope that you'll join us for a drinks reception out in the foyer, but now it's my great pleasure to call upon Nathan to present his inaugural lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's always an honor for a speaker for people to come and hear him speak. And so I always find it an honor that anyone would take the time to listen to me, especially on a day like this, which is a very special one for me personally. And I'd like to thank people, some of whom have come from quite a distance, including Coventry and Northern Ireland, to be here, and I really greatly appreciate this. I have said this before when I've given papers in my department. It's always a nervous time because there's a gentleman's agreement in academia that you will always assume that your colleagues do good work, but you won't actually read the work to check. And once you're giving a presentation to your own colleagues, it's kind of out in the open for everyone to see whether you're any good at what you do or not. And that's, I suppose, doubly the case with an inaugural lecture. The other thing that I always think of is a George Carlin stand-up routine where he talked about the job of being a comedian, and he says, my job is basically to think up goofy shit. Because being a political theorist, sometimes giving papers to political scientists and international relations scholars, sometimes I think that must be going through their heads when I give a paper that this guy, we must have hired him to think up goofy shit. Well, so I'd like to present some of that to you today, and you can see for yourself. The title of my paper is Difference, Time, and the Micropolitics of the Event. So I'd like to begin tonight by examining the sense of an event. The 20th century philosopher Gilles Deleuze tells us that we will never understand the sense of an event or of the ideas, bodies, and actions it comprises unless we know the relations of force and resistance wrapped into its constitution. He also says that sense is always multiple and includes the nonsensical in it. The sense of an event, which speaks not only to its meaningfulness, but to the dispositions, orientations, and directions of becoming it expresses, must be rigorously distinguished from the facts of the matter or the truth of the situation. To find the sense of an event is to find conditions that determine it without predetermining it, which is why the task of delineating sense involves the philosophical art of interpretation rather than a scientific analysis of cause and effect. If sense relates to the facts or the truth of a situation, it is not as that which determines or causes them, but rather as the reason any determination of fact or truth and any causal relation remains ambiguous. As we will see, sense is also the reason an event or situation always invokes the new, not because it leaves the situation incomplete, but because it determines it fully as something multiple. Sense is the guarantor of novelty by virtue of endowing every situation or event with the intrinsic qualities of its becoming, imparting to it a singularity that exceeds the order of identity, no matter how individuated it might be. An event is always novel because it is singular, not because it is unique or one of a kind. It is singular because it is multiple. I will elaborate on all of this by way of an example. In 1974, British television host Michael Parkinson interviewed Muhammad Ali after the boxer was named Sports Personality of the Year in the wake of defeating George Foreman to win back his title. Ali expressed doubt about whether he deserved the recognition, and he seems almost sincere because all he had to do was, quote, go out and beat a man who had no skill, no class. The man fights like a woman. He's wild, no class, no science, and ugly. And I just don't know why people think I'm so great now because I beat George Foreman. Parkinson responded that Foreman couldn't be so disrespected because he had previously beaten Joe Frazier and Ken Norton, two men who had both previously beaten Ali. And because Foreman didn't just beat them, but demolished and destroyed them. But Ali answered, no, he didn't. He just hit him with a punch that they didn't recuperate from. And when the laughter died down, Ali explained that, quote, this is why the public are so dumb and ignorant to this point. Sonny Liston knocked out Floyd Patterson twice in one round. Then I fought Floyd Patterson twice and never knocked him out. But I knocked out Sonny Liston. It's the style. And that's a point that every boxing or sports fan knows well. It's the style that makes the fight. It's the clashing styles, in short, that give the fight its sense. We must ask where these styles come from and exactly what they determine. Frazier always fights going forward. He doesn't seem to know how to retreat. He never even displays the skills or the temperament for it. How he handles things when the fight goes his way, how he responds to any external factors and to any moments when things might go against him, depend entirely on this. Against Foreman, Ali says, quote, he got hit and he don't have enough common sense to say I'm hit. I better back up. He don't back up. He gets knocked down. He don't have enough sense to say millions of dollars are involved, my heavyweight title, I'm a little groggy. It's easier to get knocked down again. You need about 20 seconds to cool off. They can't think that much. So right away, he gets right up, and then, instead of retreating, he runs into another one. He gets knocked down. He don't realize, I'm lucky I got knocked down twice. I'm getting a third chance. He gets up, and he runs back into another one. And he gets knocked down again. He still hasn't woke up. Boy, I'm down for the fourth. He got knocked down 6 times, and on the 6th time, he got up to walk right back into another one. Now, the fact of the matter is that Foreman beat Frazier. But in a sense, Frazier beat himself. Or rather, the sense of the fight, structured by the clash of the fighters' styles, maintains this ambiguity, since both these realities are true. But even if the truth lay elsewhere, even if it was Frazier who won the fight, managing to get to Foreman first and knock him out, in short, even if his style worked, it wouldn't change the sense of the fight, inasmuch as the sense is a matter of the way the competing styles made the fight, irrespective of who actually won or lost, or who won and lost. So sense is a determination of the fight, but it's indifferent to who actually wins. It's indifferent to the fact of how the fight ends. And it's the same sense which would determine completely different outcomes. Ali himself wasn't known as a hard puncher. He couldn't fight like Foreman or Frazier even if he wanted. But in his younger days, he could fight with his hands down, inviting opponents to punch first, which made it easier to hit them because he was faster than them. It's the relative speed that's important. Ali's fighting style, like Foreman's and Frazier's, both what he could do and what he could get away with doing when younger, what he had to change when he got older, isn't formed in a vacuum, but emerged from the relational context that formed him as a fighter, a context that relates him to his competition in terms of more or less speed, quickness, height, reach, and power. Ali's style follows directly from these immanent relations and remains valid only within the setting of the ring. Trying to measure these relations of more or less using a fixed scale, which might seem to offer an objective set of facts about Ali the fighter, makes little sense. What would it mean to say that Ali is twice as fast as Foreman, or that Foreman punches twice as hard? These external measures provide at best statistical averages. They offer a factual truth, but only by abstracting fighters from the concrete situation in which their power is exercised. Indeed, what is notable about the rope-a-dope strategy Ali used against Foreman is that while Foreman wasted most of his energy throwing wild haymakers that hurt Ali very much less than it appeared they did, Ali regularly hit Foreman with straight punches that Foreman walked onto and that wore him down in a few rounds. Put simply, their respective styles and strategies meant that in the fight it was Ali who punched harder than Foreman. And this is because the style formed by immanent relations makes both the fight and the sense of the fight. The sense of a thing or an event is a product of clashing forces, where, like boxers, each dominating or resisting force is what it is only in the context of their struggle. There is a micropolitics to the sense of the event that emerges from the struggle of forces that constitute it. There is no equality among these forces, the idea of equality again implying an external standard of measure. Every clash of forces is always asymmetrical. The event has sense because the forces can be only what they are. Fraser can't retreat. Ali can dance. What they are follows from the way they are constituted reciprocally by relations of more or less. That is to say, how they are constituted by their differences. But as sense is an independent of the facts or truths of the matter, this determination is not a predetermination and has no predictive value. Almost no one no one could have predicted with absolute certainty that Ali would beat Foreman, and of course almost no one thought he would. But when the fight ended as it did, with the idea of Ali winning and of Foreman losing made sense, and in a way it seemed like destiny. The last point speaks to the temporal aspect of the determination conferred by sense, a sense that, quote, it always had to be, right? It always had to be this way. That would obtain even for the diametrically opposed state of affairs in which Foreman won and Ali lost. Ali does talk about that in the interview. If he had lost, everyone would have done da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and it would have made sense why he lost, just as it makes sense that he won, right? It would have been the same sense, right? But despite what it might seem, this sense of destiny does not imply any causal necessity. Destiny, as Deleuze says, accords very badly with such determinism, but very well with freedom. And there is always freedom in the event precisely because the forceful struggle that makes sense always involves relations of domination, resistance, inequality, reversal, and transmutation. The structure that gives sense to the event also guarantees that things can be otherwise. So sense thus arises from an immanent and forceful relations of difference and is expressed in a form of temporality. These must be analyzed further as they break with traditional understandings of difference in time. Their rethinking has been a central feature of political theories of the last few decades that, influenced by contemporary European philosophy, have sought to move away from simplified conceptions of the disengaged rational subject that have dominated liberal political thought, that have also sought to expand the scope of the political beyond traditional focus on institutions in the public sphere, and have sought to understand the conditions that bring about the new. I will return first to difference, which has taken a special importance in attempts to move away from this idea of the subject, disengaged subject, and the assumptions of identity that surround it. Here, we may distinguish two types or two orders of difference. The first might be called dialectical or oppositional. It displaces an identity by referring this identity outside of itself, but it also consolidates the same identity by providing a marker that allows this identity to define itself through contradistinction. We can think of how black might be said to allow white to be defined by being its opposite, or how evil is able to define good by being what the good is not, or the female is said to define the male by its supposed lack of what the male has, and so forth. This form of difference functions reciprocally, as white defines black by opposing it just as black defines white, and so on. In contrast, we might think of a second form of difference as one that does not participate in this interplay of identification and reciprocal determination, remaining stubbornly non-identical, a difference that is neither black nor white, good nor evil, male nor female, and so on. Insofar as an identity refers it beyond itself and relates to this enigmatic difference, it cannot define itself in opposition to it because the other no longer serves as a fixed marker. And in this way, identity is displaced and deconstructed by this difference without being reestablished in a second moment. The question, from the perspective of the problem of sense, concerns the status of identity in light of this second difference. Many of the political theories advanced today retain an identitarian approach by continuing to associate sense with the consolidation of a field of identities through relations of opposition able to delineate them. On their terms, the neither nor-ness of this second-order difference must be excluded from the oppositional structures that consolidate identity in order for an identity to be. And even though this exclusion can never be complete or final, it's still in the temporary exclusion that an ephemeral but nevertheless real coherence of identity can be established. This moment of identity, in turn, is taken to be necessary for any meaningful subjectivity to exist. No subject, in short, could act meaningfully and coherently without at least a moment of unity and identity to give it definition and direction. There can be no sense, according to these theories, unless there is such a subject, and this entails the constitutive exclusion of difference. Second order, enigmatic, non-identical difference, then, functions as a limit concept, defining a horizon in which only identity makes sense. Thus, even while the theories that advance this view displace the disengaged subject, presumed to have an identity prior to and independent of its relations, they replace it with a subject that attains a comparable status through a temporary unity that stabilizes its identity. Such theories thereby ultimately affirm that the identity of the subject, even if fleeting, remains a sine qua non of political and ethical thought. For without identity, they say, there would be only senselessness. Now, we could easily question whether the kind of effective agency we associate with subjectivity, one to which we attribute the coherence of thinking, reflecting, and choice, really depends upon such a moment of unity. When a jury unanimously votes for a conviction, can it not be the case that the 12 members have among them, depending on their aggregate level of schizophrenia, 12 or 24 or 124, different reasons and factors at play in their assent? When a political party acts in unison, doesn't necessarily mean its members identify themselves with the same or even with compatible ideologies and goals. And when we as individuals act in determinate ways, can it not be the case, as Nietzsche says, it is always the case, that the, quote, inextricable multiplicity of ascending and descending life processes entailed by, quote, our multitude and disgregation of impulses simply manages through their strife and friction to move us in one way or another, and our conscious selves, after the fact, identify with this movement and declare, this is what I chose to do, or this is what I willed. Nietzsche would always say your unconscious drives move you in some direction or another, and it's after the fact that your conscious self says, that's what I intended to do. The charming little idea of free will, of the free will of the subject, Nietzsche tells us, is one of the great trollings in the history of Western philosophy. So enticing because it is so easy to refute, and yet it invites us to refute it all the same. And refutation, as we know, always ends up feeding a troll, right? It also ends up normalizing him by bringing him into the framework of rational discourse. All you have to do is remember the Milo Yiannopoulos interview on Channel 4 a month and a half ago or so, right? To remember that. Think of trolls. Don't feed a troll. But the critique that replaces the subject of free will with the subject of temporary unified will is one that failed to realize it has been trolled, because it unconsciously agrees to everything the troll had proposed in the first place. We can see this in the way their critique insists all the more on the unity of the willing subject by suggesting that an alternative would be an incoherent pandemonium and chaos of a self that lacked any organization or order whatsoever. Against all this, we must see subjectivity emerging from a multiplicity of pre-personal and impersonal forces that neither come together in unity nor degrade into a chaotic scattering of disconnected and disparate differences, precisely because these forces are what they are only due to their relations to one another. This means that without forming a unity, these forces are nevertheless woven together in a synthesis Their coherence is found in the multiplicity of the synthesis, not in any unification. On these terms, second-order, non-identical difference is no longer what must be excluded in order to establish sense in the form of an identity and unity. Instead, it functions as a conduit that weaves together differences and defines the sense of a multiplicity as such. The sense of an individual or collective is given through differences, but only insofar as these differences pass through a knot of difference that links them in relations of heterogeneity and discontinuity such that they never simply correspond to or oppose one another. We must come to see that concretely and in terms of what they express rather than how they are identified, there is no opposition between black and white, good and evil, male and female, and the like, but instead a more subtle and nuanced differentiation. Identity and its correlate opposition are abstractions in relation to this concrete multiplicity of sense. Identity and opposition do not make sense. At best, they result from it. We can still acknowledge the real existence of identity and unity, but only at the level of appearances and effects that this weaving of forces engenders. We must see the stability of identity and its apparent endurance over time as comparable to the churned-up wake left by a ship moving through water, or to the contrails of an airplane in flight. From a perspective of a great distance, such as from the ground looking up at the sky, or from the window of a plane looking down on the water, these patterns really do appear stable and fixed, and could not appear otherwise. But seen up close, these patterns of water and vapor are dynamic and ever-changing. We must apply this same logic to ourselves and to others. The stability of our own or another's character may seem obvious, and it is certainly real. We may all know someone who for years has had a sarcastic sense of humor and a bit of a short temper. Alternatively, our mothers may tell us that this is the way we have always been. But since no one remains the same over time, each of us becoming different both physically and spiritually, as the context in which we find ourselves and the relations we have to others change, if someone does retain a certain character over time, it cannot be for the same reasons because he or she is not even the same person. The constants are only the somewhat consistent effects of the way in which we become in time. Their consistency and identity does exist, but it exists in the effect, not in the being. None of this is to say that identity and unity are unimportant. The stability they express still confers at least some form of sense to ourselves and to the events in which we are implicated. In some cases, this may be of the most profound and highest importance. But their importance does not make them foundational, and it does not mean that they are not merely an overall image projected off of conflicting forces that never cease to be multiple and different. Moreover, this importance does not extend to making this identity the base for agency of a subject. We might still treat what we might still treat as conscious choice of an apparently unified and reflexive subject always exists against a background of forces and conditions whose agency has nothing to do with unity or choice. If Joe Frazier chooses to go forward after getting knocked down, and he may really consciously make this choice, it is in keeping with his being the kind of fighter who, formed within a conflictual multiplicity, couldn't have chosen otherwise. We have the beliefs and values we deserve, and we make the conscious choices we are supposed to make, given who and what we are, and what we are is a function of a background of sense. It is in this background that we find the concrete sense of ourselves, not as subjects, but rather as selves that are multiple and different. We find sense in difference, not in the exclusion of difference requisite for the consolidation of identity. And whenever our political theories or our politics seek identity, this sense is abstracted away. I now turn to time. Recent political theories have begun exploring alternative conceptions to time that have sought to move recent political theories that have begun exploring alternative conceptions of time. I wrote this, I should be able to read it. My eyes are the closest to it. Have sought to move beyond everyday notions of time as a neutral medium in which things pass and change, seeing it instead as an active force that drives change in perhaps creative and unpredictable ways. Frequently, these theories focus on time as a dynamic moving force, one that stretches, contracts, and explodes forward, impacting on the things and events that exist in time and propelling them into an always open future. Time, in this respect, is seen as the dynamic agency of change. The problem with his language has less to do with its reliance on metaphors than with the logical conundrums it invites by begging the question of exactly in what medium time might be said to stretch, contract, or explode. A time that moved or changed, Kant tells us, implies another time in which this dynamism occurs, and leads to the problem of regress, since the second time would have to move or change in a third time, and so on ad infinitum. Against such views, we must conceive of time not as a medium or a flow, but as a static temporal structure. As Deleuze explains, time is the structure or the form of what changes, and this structure or form it does not itself change. Things and events have a temporal structure that conditions the way they move or change in time by putting them out of sync with themselves. They move or change because their temporal structure precludes their ever being synchronous with themselves, and so of ever having the self-sameness that an identity would require. They are necessarily different to themselves because of the way past, present, and future are embedded in them. It does not allow them to endure as the same. This temporal structure is a structure of sense in multiplicity along the lines already discussed, but it is here recast in terms of temporal determinations. Now we can understand the way difference manifests itself in this temporal structure by following Deleuze's use of the term incompossibility. The incompossible is a concept taken from Leibniz. It differs from the possible and the impossible. An incompossibility for Leibniz is logically possible but incompatible with the things and events of this world, and as such, it must belong to another world. Leibniz gives the example of Adam the non-sinner. Since sinning, or not sinning, concerns Adam's existence rather than his essence, the predicate does not sin can be attributed to Adam without contradiction. But the Adam who does not sin implies a completely different world, with a completely different past, present, and future, making Adam the non-sinner incompatible with this world, whose individuals and events are compatible only with the Adam who sins. But, for Leibniz, these incompossible realities become an infinity of alternate worlds from which God chooses this world as the best possible one. Our world, he says, is the best one possible because even though Adam's sin introduces evil into our world, through the story of sin and the redemption by Christ, it offers the greatest possible variety with the greatest possible order. Deleuze, however, insists on a scenario in which incompossibilities belong to the same world. Such a world would be characterized by an even greater real variety, but at the cost of any possible order. It would contain such radical differences that ideas of simple causality and moral truth break down. It would be a world in which the question of Adam's sinning is undecidable. Or rather, it would be a world in which Adam both sins and does not sin because it depends on one's point of view. Such a world thus accords with Nietzsche's doctrine of perspectivism, where there are no facts but only interpretations, but where these interpretations are products of a struggle of competing forces in a world of difference. This struggle determining the sense of these perspectives regardless of their hegemonic or marginal status. But that world is our world. It's precisely our world when we conceive it immanently from a position that rejects transcendent truths and values, which always posit identity and continuity. When we get rid of transcendent standards of good and evil, whether or not Adam sins or does not sin depends on your point of view. It depends on all the different ways in which you could read that event. Our world is a world of incompossibilities, and as such, it is out of sync with itself, caught up in a multiplicity of incompatible temporalities and lines of time. A world of incompossibilities entails a special form of repetition. Like a science fiction story about parallel universes, the sinning and non-sinning atoms are indiscernible yet completely different, and yet they also belong in the same world. In this respect, each is a repetition of the other without either being the true or original atom that the other one copies. But this repetition in any event is not chronological, as one atom does not follow the other or become the other in time. Instead, they exist simultaneously in a discontinuous structure of time. This temporal structure gives sense to the way things pass in time in terms of the incompossibilities that they express at every moment. It confers sense that is always multiple and incongruent. Consider the breakdown of a long relationship. As some of you know, I consider this a lot. Right? Where from one perspective, it seems that each partner has changed and grown apart from the other. Yet, in another sense, neither one has changed. The traits that made each person incompatible with the other having been there from the start, so that each only becomes what he or she already was. Both of these realities are true, even though they are incompossible, invoking indiscernible yet completely different individuals, with each partner being at once a person in love with his or her other half and a person never truly connected to the other throughout the relationship. The sense of the relationship and the breakdown, as they come to pass and are interpreted and reinterpreted afterwards, necessarily include these incompossibilities, which is why it takes such a long time, if such a time is ever reached, for the story of the relationship to have a settled meaning. In the absence of any such settlement, you might consider reformulating it as a philosophical problem and use it as a teaching tool. The sense of this relationship is incompatible with a single truth because it entails a multiplicity of irreducible and incompatible timelines lived by different subjectivities. And this thus precludes there ever being one story adequate to the full range of what it expresses. But the consequence of this is that the entire passage of people and events through time is ungrounded. No past conditions and determines the present, since the past is a multiplicity of incompossibles and undecidabilities, nor does any future impose a telos or a necessary progression on it. And the present itself remains untimely, the present event of the relationship breakdown always having already happened before, long before, but having also not happened yet. All of this in keeping with what Nietzsche says of the breakdown of our relationship with God, who dies in 1882 when a madman cries out in a marketplace, yet who was also dead from the start. And still the madman's time is not yet, as we, the perpetrators, don't actually know what has happened. In this way, the structure of incompossibility serves as the guarantor of the new by virtue of constituting the openness of what becomes in time and ensuring that nothing endures as the same. If you want to know how you move on from the relationship, it is by the way your own temporality compels you to become different, which means that you are not even the one moving on, since you are not actually you anymore. It's someone else who is moving on. Now, this structure of difference and temporality precludes the possibility of a unified subject, as so much of our political and moral thought understands it. But this does not mean that the complex and multiple self we theorize in its place is divorced from ethics, understood as an ethos or a way of life that makes contact with politics and thus becomes a political ethics. It is here that considerations of difference, time, and sense cast themselves out in a domain that we can, following Deleuze and Guattari, call the micropolitical. The micropolitical is a domain of forceful relations of power and desire whose mechanisms and dynamics both form and undermine the concepts and categories that structure our macropolitical, institutional, and social life, including the identities and oppositions that sometimes seem to exhaust the sense of who we are. But for that same reason, it is also a domain where analyses based on identity, opposition, truth, representation, and the subject are inappropriate and inapplicable. It is also a realm where ethics and politics converge by way of practices of self-formation. There is a micropolitical task of forming oneself as a political animal that parallels the task Foucault identifies in his later writings on ethical self-formation. But this is decidedly not a task of forming oneself as a political subject consolidated around an identity. Just as for Foucault, the task of ethical self-formation is not that of becoming a moral subject. Now, there is, of course, a moral subject in Foucault's account, who relates to a moral code by way of obedience or disobedience and thereby becomes a moral or an immoral subject. Every society, Foucault says, has games of truth and rules of self-formation that establish the practices by which one forms oneself as a subject who will relate to the code in some way. There is already a set of outcomes from earlier struggles among power relations that delineates who and what we are and can become in a process of forming ourselves. But the real practice of ethics involves a self-formation of a different sort, which arises at the moments when these outcomes that condition us, the identities, truths, and rules surrounding the moral code, show themselves to be inadequate in the face of a problem that exceeds the binaries that define them. The ancient Greeks, for example, encountered the problem of the morality of the morally ambiguous status of boys, as the available alternatives could not be separated cleanly into right and wrong or good and evil. As Foucault shows, this resulted in a more nuanced and experimental ethics by which the Greeks used the problem of boys and the codes, identities, and practices at their disposal to expand themselves beyond what they were, inventing new ways to relate to the other and to themselves. Their subjectivity, in this way, was realized in a move away from being moral subjects relating to a moral code, and this occurred even while the code itself remained largely unchanged in the process. And as Foucault notes, it remains largely unchanged today. Now, Micropolitics, as Deleuze and Guattari offer it, similarly starts with our already being embedded in a world that offers us established identities, practices, and truths. These being products of strife and conflict, but nevertheless presenting themselves as something fundamental. And it then asks us how these can be put to work to reconfigure both them and us. We survey the relations of force and desire that constitute us, they say, and consider how they might be open to mutation and reassembly. We locate the friction points and points of fracture where they can be undone. There are no iron-hard rules, and the criteria for judging success is a vague idea that these changes should allow us to expand or overcome what we are by opening us up and connecting us to new productive differences. We must proceed with caution, Deleuze and Guattari further warn, and hope to avoid ruptures that could destroy us or that might lead us to reactionary dead ends. For experiments can be dangerous, and there's no guarantee that they will end well. This ethics of becoming something different is also a politics, not only because it directly connects to the political and social formations in which we are embedded, but because it involves a pragmatism and strategy in relation to the obstacles we encounter and the relays we establish. And so it requires us to negotiate a situation in which we find ourselves in whatever contingencies we may suddenly face. In some cases, it might be better to seek to remain what we already are. Such descriptions of the processes and procedures of experimental self-formation quickly invite the retort that there must be a subject involved in analyzing, reflecting, and deciding on the path ahead. But this misconstrues the situation, for it is not a matter of subjective choice. A person doesn't choose to change, as funny as that might sound. A person doesn't choose to change in the first instance because it is not about what one wants, but about what one desires. And our desires are always a function of the way we are constituted as a multiplicity. As Nietzsche says, if I desire to combat a drive, say for example the drive to smoke, it is only because my consciousness and intellect have become aligned with a rival drive within me. It is the conflict amongst the drives that is taking place, not an intellect standing separate from and above the drives and making a choice of how to control them. And what is often referred to in political theory as the second-order desire to be a person with certain desires is for Nietzsche nothing other than a first-order desire that we have intellectualized. Beyond this, however, a person doesn't change simply because he or she chooses to change, but because of a force of a problem that impacts them and to which they must respond. We change because of an encounter. We change because we're faced with something. We change because we're hit by something, right? Mike Tyson famously said that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Right? And at this point, how one responds is entirely a function of the existing structure of the multiplicity that makes one who and what one is. Joe Frazier kept going forward into more punches because that's the kind of fighter he was. Ali changed tactics completely between the first and second rounds, going to the ropes and trolling Foreman into punching himself out. And Foreman reacted in the only way that made sense for him to react given who and what he was in the context of the fight. Perhaps had there been a rematch, he would have paced himself better, although perhaps Ali would have had a different strategy for the second fight. All of which is to say that if there is a choice being made, it's not the choice of a subject, but of a self in its multiplicity, and this self chooses in the sense of determining what connections can and cannot be made to it, and thus what it is able to do or become. But this determination, once more, is a determination of sense, not truth, and thus remains independent of the forms of change or stasis we may actually realize while serving as the guarantor for the openness needed to realize something new. It is a determination by way of difference, and return to the beginning, it is difference that makes the style in turn that makes the fight, thereby determining the sense of what we become. Now, we are micropolitical before we are political, and we have the political and social lives that we ought to have given the micropolitics that constitute us and in which we participate. If we wish to move our politics beyond what it is at its most spiteful, vindictive, and reactionary, we must begin by changing ourselves. And in this respect, it is instructive once again to turn to Nietzsche, who writes in Twilight of the Idols that a, quote, well-constituted human being, a happy one, must perform certain actions and instinctively shrinks from other actions. He transports the order of which he is the physiological representative into his relations with other human beings and with things, end quote. The wager of micropolitics is by working to constitute ourselves in certain ways, necessities of a political nature can follow. If these formations can affirm multiplicity, can affirm the multiplicity that we already are, then what we might be able to affirm is pluralism, as both an ethics that feeds into politics and as a strategy for political engagement. To see the possibilities of forming ourselves as political animals in this way is a crucial payoff of engaging with the problematic of micropolitics, and one that makes this engagement a political task, even if it does not present a political project as traditionally understood. Thank you.
Don't leave. Thank you. That was absolutely fantastic, as one would expect. Thank you so much. I've been called to say a few words here, and I'd like to. Would you want to just stand here, please? Thank you. Professor Witter and I have known each other quite a long time. What? 24 years. Okay. Not really, because I'm not actually that old. Okay. I don't do age. No. Yeah, we've known each other quite a long time, 24 years, two and a half decades almost. Thanks. Anyway, so I would like to say just a couple of words to contextualize the Nathan that I know. I would say that there are three main word concepts. The first one is fortitude. I met Nathan because both of us decided, not together but independently, to move to the UK because we were curious. That's why. Because we wanted to see what there was to see. And I landed here a few years before Nathan, but when we really started to meet each other was when you were at Essex, and I became involved with his PhD as one of his supervisors. And it was then that it was, for anybody who's ever traveled, who's ever been a migrant, who's an immigrant, or don't even know you're being an immigrant, you just end up as one, it's quite a challenging experience. You can misread body languages, you can misread everything, actually. I couldn't even understand the English language when I first came here, and probably neither did you. So I would say the very first aspect that you probably know, because you're colleagues with Nathan, is his fortitude. I would say the second really fabulous thing about Nathan is his intellect, obviously demonstrated by this of many papers and books and so on and so forth. But he's got the fortitude that allows you to just stay sane or something like that at 4 o'clock in the morning while you're dealing with relationships that don't work or whatever the thing is. Yes. It is something that has made him an honest intellectual, not just an intellectual. He breathes and feels and lives the kind of remarks he's making today. It's not an abstraction, even if you are a philosopher, if we both are philosophers. So I would say his intellectual prowess is very important. The last one, which I think is important, and perhaps I think it's the most important, really, is his ability to have humor, which is couched in love. And I think that that's a very particular kind of humor. It's not a doing down of somebody. It's not making fun of somebody. It is actually enjoying the moment and then figuring out the hilarious aspect of it that makes it work or not work. Now, one of the things you may or may not, you probably do know this about Nathan because he doesn't hide a few things, most of his backstory. But one of the backstories is that he was a ballroom dancer. Do you know this? Some of them knows, yes, and quite a very, and now everyone knows this, and quite a very good ballroom dancer, as it turns out. Okay, yeah. Anyway, but he used to bring his examples of ballroom dancing into the discussions on political theory and political studies and so on and so forth. And at one point, when we were in one of the seminars, this was a seminar directed by a very well-known political philosopher, Ernesto Leclos. He and Ernesto agreed on many things, but one of the things they definitely agreed on was that they were not going to agree on everything, or even most things. They might have agreed on many things, but not all things. Anyway, and one of the things that he challenged Ernesto on, Ernesto had just written a very complex paper on Aristotle, and do you remember this? The whole. Oh, yeah. Yes. So Nathan decided to critique when no one else would speak, because of course the other thing about Nathan is, like I said, with his fortitude, he's willing to say things. He's willing to step in where some people would fear to go. And he was very bravely confronting Ernesto around the question of Aristotle's notion of the political, and the notion of lack, and the notion of phallus that kept getting a lot of airtime in the 90s and noughts. Yes. And you attacked it quite well in terms of how one had to understand dance, and that you might have two people in a dance situation. You might have them, because you were ballroom dancing, so it wasn't just sort of, anyway, it was ballroom dancing, so it was this waltzing around and these twirls and these kind of mad moves, and it still created the energy of being present, which Aristotle on up could not account for. And it was such a profound moment when he said this that he burst out laughing. He doesn't remember any of this, I can see that from the face. He burst out laughing, and he just won over the entire group, who at that point wasn't sure what was going on. So I just wanted to say that you're very lucky, which you probably know this anyway, but you're very lucky to have him here and his kind of mad, crazy, wonderful ways into the world. And I just wanted to thank you for being such an important person, both in the world but also in my life. So thank you. Mwah.
Thanks. It'd be lovely if you can join us for a drink and reception now outside. And if I can just add my thanks to others as well. And thank you, Johnny, for that. Nathan, it was a knockout. What can I say?